Good morning, everybody. Another great day. Looking forward to this day a whole lot. Going to record a history lecture. Going to go see my grandkids. We're in the World War I class. This is Dr. Winkler again. And this is lecture number 15. Getting a little deeper into the war now. A lot more things are going on. Quite frankly, terrible things are going on. Well, last time I was in the middle of a discussion dealing with some of the animosities the various peoples feel toward the British. I'm talking largely the Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders, who believe, at least many of them believe, that they were purposely slaughtered. In other words, their casualty rates were much higher than those of the other British troops, simply because the commanders thought that they were more expendable. And you'd rather have these people die than the British from Britain, England, Scotland, that kind of thing. And I was telling you about this story I had talking to an Australian about these kinds of things. And he was quite furious. He hated the English with literally a passion. Remember the quote I have up here. If I saw an Englishman on fire, I wouldn't urinate on him to put him out. And he said this is an attitude. This is very typical of many Australians. Remember, in that discussion, I also asked him, well, why is this animosity so strong? And he did point out a number of things, one of which was the treatment by the British of many Australians during the First World War. Let me go up and tell you a somewhat similar story. Look at the New Zealand troops. Usually when we talk about the Anzacs, we have, 5, 6 Australian divisions, like one New Zealand division. They are clearly there. But the population of New Zealand being quite a bit lower than Australia, you would clearly believe that they would have fewer men that they could put in the military and send to the front. This is the case. However, many years ago, I got to be friends. I was young at the time. He was elderly at the time. A professor of geography. His name was Professor Gray. And I guess one of the reasons why we kind of hit it off, became at least friends for a while, was the fact that I knew something about the war. I would talk to this guy. I remember talking to him, and he mentioned the Somme, the Battle of the Somme, which we will discuss later, which took place in 1916. Yeah, I knew about it. I read about it. We could discuss it in some detail. He said his father was at the Somme in 1916. Of course, before he even proceeded, my blood goes cold. Oh my golly, what a horrible, horrible experience. He's attacking, his father is attacking with New Zealand troops. He got stitched by a machine gun in the chest. Didn't say how many bullets hit him, but you can imagine that probably should have killed him. In any event, he's laying in a shell hole, terribly wounded, can't move, can't do anything. And then he's kind of going in and out of consciousness. And then there's these British litter carriers that came trying to pull in the wounded, sometimes pulling in the dead as well, pulling in the wounded. And as they came to the hole, they looked down at him and says, "Oh, another one." So they brought him in, fixed him up. He did survive, went back to New Zealand. Anyway, Professor Gray told me how bitter his father was. I don't know if it was bitter, but he's entirely bitter about the military experience or what it was. But at least a lot of the bitterness at least, that Professor Gray was explaining about his father was his bitterness against the British. These men had gone out and fought for Britain. And of course, many were killed. In the case of his father, he was severely injured in the war. Very bad wounds. And at the end of the war, they treated these men very badly. In fact, his father had wanted to immigrate to Britain, but there's no consideration given for this. You can suffer, you can bleed for Britain, but when it's over, we will give you no deference at all. So there's bitterness. There's bitterness on more than one level. I did ask him about his father. His father died many years ago. And talking to Professor Gray is a very interesting man because he's teaching in the United States. And of course, Americans do have a tendency, from national pride among other things, to look upon our institutions as being, shall we say, some of the best ever. And he says, well, I come from a different tradition. I look at American institutions and the institutions of New Zealand, and I'm not saying that you people are superior to us. Interesting man. Fun conversations. Let's take a look at the naval blockade. Perhaps what I should have on our study guide up here is not blockade, naval blockade. So let's look at the laying of the blockade. Remember, in all the discussions we had, going way back earlier in this class, we were discussing the laws of war. And I should not neglect the naval laws of war. What we have here in a couple of statements, that a distant blockade is illegal. Okay, this is a Declaration of Paris in 1856. What is a distant blockade? Let's get a map of the North Sea out here and tell you what I'm talking about. So the British want to blockade Germany. Well, the major ports are up here. Hamburg, Bremen. Of course, the British want no trade to take place from here. Now, what is legal is if you take your fleet and you come out here and you put your fleet and you lay your mines here, for example, to blockade the ports themselves. That is legal according to naval warfare. However, the British blockade, not just here, the distance blockade is going to include areas down here near the English Channel, where there's going to be a lot of British combat vessels, battleships. Anytime a neutral country wants to trade with Germany, for example, and they come up the English Channel, they're going to be intercepted. They're going to be intercepted and they're going to be ordered to take their goods, whatever they happen to be using, to the British ports, where the British will take them and use them for their own purposes. Sometimes the people that are so intercepted are unhappy because they say the Germans would give them a better price for their goods than will the British. Of course, the British will bargain when they see it. Well, we can get this for less. It doesn't take very long. It doesn't take very long at all for the various nations that would like to make a little more money dealing with Germany. That there's no reason to even try to push yourself here because you'll be intercepted by a British naval vessel and you would be unable to proceed. So this is an aspect of a distance blockade, sure. The British fleet moves around quite a bit during the war, but the main places where they actually see them are right down here by the English Channel and up here among what we call Scapa Flow in this area. Britain has major naval bases up here. So if you're trying to trade with Germany, this is a little bit challenging because it's a chokehold. There's a possibility you could come up in this direction. Of course, the distance is greater, the time would be longer, take a little bit more time, a little bit more fuel, but the profits are still potentially there. But the British, of course, they have their navy up here. Late in the war, like 1918, the British decided that they were going to have a literal minefield that's going to cover this area. So you have a literal minefield covering this area. Once again, this is a distance blockade. Of course, the naval vessels, the ships are going to be out here as well. However, if you are blockading trade coming from here to here, and you're blockading trade coming from here to here. What does that do to trade going to the Netherlands or to Denmark or to Norway or to Sweden? I will come back to this. We talk in just a few minutes when we're talking about the embargoes. But now the British, later with the help of the Americans, do have the ability to not only strangle Germany, but to strangle other countries that are trading with Germany. Okay. Now we have another issue here. The Declaration of London, 1909, big conference before the First World War. Almost every major naval power in the world comes to this. The United States is represented. That's a little unusual. The United States, being isolationist, rarely sent delegates to these kind of conferences. But as a burgeoning naval power, we are very powerful by 1909. That we need, or we think we need to become involved. So delegates come from all over. And not only this, they say what you can blockade. You can blockade munitions. You can blockade weapons. You can blockade anything that the enemy can use to make war. However, you cannot, I got block here, it means blockade. You cannot blockade food. In other words, you cannot starve your enemy in this manner. But see, if you're intercepting a vessel that happens to be heading for Germany, you can stop it and you can go on board. What if you found food and munitions? What if your munitions were stored in some place where it's a little bit harder for you to find? You had to look a little more carefully to find it. Isn't it just easier if you, from the British standpoint, just blockade everything? Now, there is a consternation, if you will, about the Declaration of London. And that is that the various representatives from the various nations, including the United States, are signatories. They sign this. Does that make the declaration valid? Well, you can make that statement. However, really what you have to do is to take that declaration back to your country. If you're Britain, you take it to Parliament. If you're Germany, you take it to the Reichstag. If you're the United States, you take it to Congress for its ratification. Excuse me, that's actually what puts it into force. And this was not done. Can we say it's a good idea? But unless your enemy, unless your nation, shall I say, formally states that this is what you're doing, it's invalid. So can we say it's invalid? Pie in the sky, perhaps. As we look at the conduct of Britain, later the United States, and Germany during the war, they're not following this very carefully at all. So it's nice talk. Now, an illegal blockade. You can blockade. Boy, I'm having trouble this morning. You can blockade your enemy. In this case, Germany. We play a semantic game here. I call it illegal blockade. When you blockade Germany, it's your enemy. When you have embargoes, same idea, simply a different word. Use the embargo on neutral nations. It's the same thing. You don't trade with them. Why don't you trade? I mean, Netherlands, Switzerland, Norway, Sweden are all neutral powers. But you see, Germany is trading with them. They're neutrals. They can trade with them. What I don't have here is Switzerland. Switzerland's way down in the central part of Europe. Can we say there are embargoes put on Switzerland, but the blockade, meaning the Navy, since Switzerland is a landlocked nation, there's no Navy around it at all. You can do things to strangle Switzerland's economy so they can't trade with the Germans. So they're part of this discussion. However, the blockade is really what we're doing with the Navy. Since Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, Norway are trading with Germany, we put embargoes on them as well. And when they need food, equipment, machinery, fertilizers, it's denied them. And they have a difficulty feeding their own nation. I have never read a study about the neutral nations where the Allies would not trade with them. Hopefully, strangling them, they could also strangle the Germans. Now, I'll talk about this in just 1 minute, about the death rates that go up in Germany because of the blockade. I've never found a study as to what happened to the death rates in these other neutral countries because of the blockades or embargoes. I do run across this, and I'm not sure how on earth to mention this, but I have read that part of the embargoes was actually aimed at Spain. I don't think I have to pull out a map of Europe to show you, so look at it, to show you where Spain is. You all know this. I need an explanation. I can't get it. Is Spain trading with Germany? How would you trade with Germany? You're going to get up here, you're going to get across France, you're going to get across Italy. Hopefully what I read was incorrect. I just can't see any reason why you put an embargo on Spain. However, sometimes you see that listed. Now remember, I was talking about this, remember Switzerland's down here. Switzerland shares a border with Germany and with Austria, but also shares a border with France and Italy. Switzerland therefore can easily trade with Germany and Austria. But if it needs fertilizers and food, whatever, which they have to get from Italy and France, of course Switzerland can be cut off. Ships. Okay. Ships, mines. I already mentioned this a little bit. Ships, of course, transport the food. You place mines. Now, we hear a lot about the British placing mines. They place large numbers of sea mines. So anytime your vessel happens to whack into this, it blows up the mine and does damage to your vessel. If it's bad enough damage, the vessel sinks. Now, I talked about if you want to make sure that your ship doesn't hit a British mine, you're going to have to go to a British port. A lot of times what the British will do is they'll escort you in. You see, sometimes even over here, they'll lay mines so the German submarines won't come in and get you. But if you're going into the port and you don't know where the mines are, you can have a problem. You don't want the Germans to know where the mines are for obvious reasons because they can go around them. But sometimes you simply have to be escorted into the port and escorted out of the port so your vessel doesn't inadvertently hit the mines. British do send ships out here to drop mines in front of the ports. The Germans try to do this, but really all they have is submarines. The submarines aren't large by World War II standards. They do carry a few torpedoes. Remember, I already mentioned they have a deck gun on them. That's really their throwaway. That's their weapons they're attacking enemy vessels with. But sometimes you actually will put a few mines on these things, and you can drop them out in the Irish Sea, and hopefully somebody will run into them. But it's very small in number. And because it's very small in number, its real impact on what's happening in the war at sea is quite minimal. A lot of people have this attitude. If you did want to push through here or push through here, if you got through there, then of course you have to run the risk of running into mines down here as well. This kind of attitude is this. Let's look at this. If your ship hits a British mine, it's your fault. Why, you stupid idiot. What are you doing in restricted areas? What are you doing things the British don't want you to do? So you do have a tendency to blame yourself. People say, our ship hit a mine. How could we be so stupid? Now, the reverse is not true as well. But if a U-boat sinks your ship, it's the Germans' fault. Can we say, therefore, there's an act of belligerence like shooting a torpedo? But isn't laying a mine also an act of belligerence? But the attitude is this: the Germans are evil if they sink your ship. If the British sink your ship, it's your own fault. You can kind of see how this does not play in Germany's favor. This is another example of bad press. Maybe I should have had this in slightly different order. Maybe I should have had Germany can't feed herself before this. Nonetheless, Germany has a growing population in the 19th century. It's growing quite rapidly. As Germany industrializes, so does its population. Particularly in the late 19th century, and this is not just true of Germany, it's true of many other countries, when the germ theory of disease has taken the scientific community by storm. And then people start looking around the late 19th century. We've got to have better sanitation. And in doing that, stopping the spread of disease as well. The survivability of small children, even adults for that matter, has a tendency to go up. Anyway, Germany's population is growing quite rapidly. But Germany can't feed itself starting in 1889. Its population at that point had overwhelmed its agricultural sector. So now, in order for Germany to survive, you've got to import food. Of course, over time, the agricultural techniques are going to get better. Yes, they're going to get better fertilizers. So the productivity of the German farming industry does go up, but it doesn't keep pace, I should say, with the population. So Germany can't feed itself. That's going to be a very big issue in 1914, when Germany has a great deal of difficulty in importing the food it badly needs. Germany has a very advanced chemical industry before, during, and after the First World War. I already mentioned this a little bit. One of the reasons why Germans went for gas is that they have the ability to produce ammonia because of their chemical industry. And from ammonia, you get chlorine. The Germans are trying to figure out how to get substitutes. The German word they use is Ersatz, substitutes or substitution. I remember taking German literature class. I have a PhD minor in German, so I took a bunch of classes. For one of these classes, and this was a short story that actually dealt at the end of the Second World War, where the Germans were once again starting. And of course, the idea both during the First World War and Second World War is that Germans are using Ersatz, substitute, to try to figure out a way of getting by. And I remember the discussion was Ersatzliebe, substitute love. It was an interesting think piece. Good literature does that for you. I remember reading this, and of course the discussion in class was essentially, in times of Mangel, what's that in English? Times of need. You do have a tendency, when you're hungry, when you're afraid, you do have a tendency to substitute what you really want for something else. It's an interesting play, interesting story. Well, let's go back to the German chemical industry in the First World War. It is very good. It's very advanced. Can we say it's probably more advanced than any other nation in the world? In fact, I have read that some of the greatest advances in chemistry took place because Germany lost 2 world wars. Then they take their chemical industry and they use it as best they possibly can to substitute what you have. You can make it somewhat similar, and try to make it fit either food or your military operation. Well, nitrates for shells. You need nitrogen in shells. Well, there's nitrogen in the atmosphere. And I can't imagine how you could possibly do this. But the Germans actually figure out how to withdraw nitrogen from the atmosphere and be able to get it into a form of nitrates and use it in shells. I remember reading an account by an American, I've already mentioned Arthur Guy MP, who wrote a book called Over the Top. He's not even out to the front yet. And he's marching up with a man, and of course he's American with the British troops. And he looks out there, it's a little bitty plane, just like 1915, little bitty plane, way out there. And when the guy says, yeah, it's a German plane. MP says, what? How could you possibly tell what it is from that distance? And the guy said, look at the anti-aircraft fire. The anti-aircraft fire was exploding in white smoke. The Allies' explosions leave a white residue. Therefore, if you have a white residue, the smoke, it's somebody firing at a German plane. Now, the German shells leave black smoke. So had they looked out there and seen the anti-aircraft fire, the shells that go up and explode, if that had been black, then that would have been an Allied plane because there would have been the Germans firing at them. So there's difference in chemical compound. I am going to say that, however, the Allies and both the Germans are using very effective explosives and very, very effective shells. Substitutes, oh my golly, you can't get coffee, so you burn you burn wheat. Okay. Before the Iron Curtain came down, this is 1983 when I'm teaching on study abroad, I had the opportunity to go into East Germany. And East Germany wanted to have their industry, shall we say, their economy within their boundaries as much as possible, because it costs more money to buy things coming in. And so I bought a chocolate bar. It said chocolate on it. I don't know what was in there, but it wasn't chocolate. It tasted roughly like cardboard or sawdust, something like that. So even in the 1980s, at least in this case, East Germans were still trying to find substitutes that worked out. The most important substitutes is not just coffee. The most important substitutes are shells and food. So, one of the reasons why Germany is hurting is because lost labor and lost fertilizers. Of course, fertilizers mean that your crops are more productive, no doubt about that at all. And phosphates are one of these. Years ago, a friend of mine said, oh, you want to have your lawn green, put these kind of fertilizers on it. Now, the difficulty putting fertilizer on your lawn, you have to mow it every day, and I'm a lazy guy. Hello. Same thing with me all the time. Well, a week is kind of long. It's not long enough. You wait 2 weeks, then pretty soon you got a big problem on your hands. I didn't want to mow it every day, but obviously fertilizers can make a big difference, not only in growing grass, but in growing food. Germany imports fertilizers from Latin America, largely phosphates, which they use on their fields. When this dries up, of course, the Germans do try substitutes, try to find other kind of fertilizers. And I'm not going to say that is totally ineffective, but I am going to say it's not nearly as good as it had been using the natural fertilizers which they got from Latin America. One of the reasons fertilizers apparently can also be used in shell production. Another reason why Britain doesn't want fertilizers to come into Germany. Lost labor. Remember, the war breaks out in August 1918. Some of the men in the farming area of Germany, of course, they're reservists, they're called up, they're given a rifle and they go out and participate in the war. Another big factor in Germany bringing in their crops is foreign laborers. The Poles do spend a lot of time, the people from Poland, Almost every year at harvest time, when you need more labor, the Poles are allowed to cross the borders. They're like migrant farm workers. They come in, they help you bring in the crops. But now, starting in 1914, the Poles are not allowed to do this. In fact, most of Poland, go back to a map of Europe, most of Poland, this is a modern map, so it's a little bit misleading. Most of Poland, of course, over here is behind the Russian lines. And obviously nobody's going to allow, at least the Russians aren't, going to allow a lot of Poles to go over here. Now, during the war, and I've already mentioned this is going to come back again, forced labor at times. Remember, there are a lot of Belgians over here that are behind German lines. They are forced to go over, many of them. Industrial workers sometimes work in factories, but a lot of them go to the farming area of Germany to help bring in the crops. But this also frees up German manpower to go out and fight the war. Germany never overcomes the loss of fertilizers, even though you have some extreme efforts here. They never overcome the loss of labor. So the agricultural sector is hurt. It's badly needed, but productivity goes down. I mean, the Germans do everything they can, even to bring in marginal land. City parks, they tear up the grass and plant potatoes. I mean, they're doing almost everything they can. Well, hunger and starvation. What's the difference between hunger and starvation? Well, hunger, you're very hungry, and it's very unpleasant. Your tummy hurts you all the time, and you have a hard time sleeping, all those kind of things. Starvation, I would say, is a little bit bigger statement, because this is actually when your body is being denied enough food for its normal body functions. In other words, your body starts to deteriorate. A lot of times in desperation for nutrients, your body will actually start pulling in, such as, of course, they'll take all your fat, but they will pull in nutrients from your muscles, and your muscle structure will suffer. So, and of course, that can do damage to all of your internal organs. You can have big problems with that. Of course, Germany has a rationing system, which is supposed to make sure that, from the rationing system, to make sure that whatever food is available is distributed properly so everybody gets, shall we say, their share of what's available. Now, this works, well, never perfectly, but can we say it works fairly well if you're on the lower levels of the German social structure? If I'm hurting and my neighbors are hurting, that's not nearly as irksome. But if you're wealthy and you can pay extra money, you see, then you're going to live better. So we have a black market. Now, this is illegal. If they catch you, you can be severely punished. But anytime there's a lot of money in something, you're going to find a way of doing this. The farmers withhold a few potatoes, withhold some crops, and then you meet in your secret location. Somebody gives you some money. Even after a while, the barter system actually started to function. People started trading not just money for food. They would actually even trade musical instruments, decorations, pendants that had a little gold in them, something like that, something of intrinsic value. Now, you can imagine how irksome this would be to the vast majority of Germans who do not have the ability to really go into the black market in a big way to get more food. While it's abundantly clear the people with the resources and money are doing quite well. We find very early in the war, even in 1915, that there are Germans that are agitating, they're complaining, we don't have enough food. Housewives complain, we don't have enough cream. Well, after a while, you have no cream at all. Actually, the starvation, the real hurt doesn't really get you until after 1914. Because one of the first things you do is you don't have enough grain to feed your cattle or your hogs. So you kill all your, not all, but you kill a lot of your hogs and kill a lot of your cattle. So initially, at least in early 1914, meat is relatively available and relatively cheap on the market. Well, that doesn't last very long. We have some of the biggest problems in Germany during the war, and the most labor strikes which we see are over food. And yes, German industry does get hurt by labor strikes. You have it in 1915, 1916, it gets worse, and it gets worse later on. Now, of course, the government appeals to your patriotism, you're suffering for the nation. That can only carry you so far. When you get so hungry, you do have a tendency to be a little bit more desperate. I mean, there are times, both during and after the war, where people are going out in the farm sector and beating people up over a sack of potatoes. I mean, it does get that extreme. Another way the government has a tendency to work with this is that if they see anybody in a certain industry, particularly men, who are either going on strike over food or pay, whatever, usually food, and or work slowdowns, complaining, you draft them. You draft all of them, send them out to the front. Are they going to like that any better? Probably not. The worst winter of the war until 1918, which is really the end of the war, is what we call the turnip winter of 1916, 1917. This is simply a bad weather. It's really what it is. You simply have bad weather. Cold weather. The kind of winters you only have maybe every 20 or 30 years in Europe. Strikes with a vengeance in the winter of 1916, 1917. I believe it had rained too much, so the potato crop was not as good as it should have been in the summer. Rain and hail, of course, is quite damaging to the wheat as well. If it's pretty bad, if you're sitting in an apartment somewhere in Germany, you can imagine what it'd be like on the front over here. So your weather doesn't just treat Germany bad, it treats a lot of nations bad. Another thing we should point out is that as we look at what's happening, if it's bad in Germany, you can imagine how bad it is in Russia. Let's go to Russia. Not only the Russian front, but even the cities. I'm going to make a big deal over this because this is going to help us understand the overthrow of the Tsar in March 1917. Because the severity of the winter hits Russia as well. And in doing so, people are cold, lack of transportation, poor crop yields. People are cold, people are hungry, people are restive, and they overthrow the Tsar. So that helps us understand some of the later phases of Russia in the war itself. Well, let's go back to the turnip winter. Remember, Germans eat a lot of potatoes. And they eat this bread that has pretty odd materials in it. Germans like dark breads. They're quite flavorful. You put a lot of rye in them. That and a little slab of meat, man, you're eating pretty good. Well, sometimes the bread goes very dark. In fact, some people say a lot of the bread is almost black. They're putting a lot of things in there that just literally is bulk. They really have a lot of fiber, but really have very little nutritional value. In fact, including sawdust. So yeah, you can eat something and you're chewing on it, there's quite a bit there. But with the lack of calories, it's really not helping you very much. So the turnip winter, lack of potatoes, the wheat crop doesn't come in. You've got a big problem. Is there anything you can use to feed your people? Well, they're growing turnips. Turnips is largely you can eat it. I think you can put it in salads or cook it up if you're a vegan, something like that. You know, turnips are good human food. On the other hand, their calorie content is very low, and that's the problem. They had been using turnips largely for pigs to feed cattle. They do better on them than people do. Of course, when they realize it's not enough, they have to use the turnips on people rather than pigs, and a little more meat ends up in the market. But that's not enough to assuage what's happening. The turnip winter of 1916-1917 until the winter of 1918-1919 is a severe trial in the German nation. Doctors usually tell us, nutritionists usually tell us, that the normal person, it varies a bit on age and size, that kind of thing, but you really need over 1,200 calories a day for your proper bodily functions. In other words, if you're going on diet and want to lose a little weight, cutting back in calories is probably a pretty good idea. But if you cut back too far, you're doing damage to your body rather than helping it. The average calorie intake, we think, in Germany during the war is about 1,000 during this winter, I said that wrong. It's about 1,000 calories a day. You're literally in the level of starvation. Many years ago, trying to improve my ability to read German. How do you improve your ability? You read. And I remember reading some stories by him. It was kind of simplified German, like for high school German. And the book had been written in the 1930s. And this man was talking about his childhood in Germany during the war, which I found very interesting, obviously. Well, one of the stories that I remember about this is that his brother and he, of course, you're very hungry. You're so hungry you couldn't sleep. In gnawing hunger pains. And unbeknownst to his mother, who probably wouldn't have approved of this, they snuck down and to the kitchen, snuck out to the kitchen, and ate rolled oats, Haferflocken, and mustard. Now, there's no calories in mustard. I ate mustard for breakfast this morning. It was rolled oats, by the way. I've never even dreamed I'm going to put mustard in that and try to see if I can possibly gag it down. These kids are so hungry, they'll, can say, virtually try anything. I like the way he said it. We went down there, wie Räuber in der Nacht, as thieves in the night, to try to get something to eat. Let me tell you another story that's popped into my memory. When I was at Utah State taking German classes, I was a history major, but I took a lot of German classes. And at Christmas time, they get together for a nice little German Christmas. It was really a lot of fun. And sing songs and tell stories. And there's a small German community, people in Logan, small German community that lived there for a long time. And they're coming to enjoy this as well. And this should have been scripted better. In fact, you should have asked people beforehand. You should have asked people beforehand if they had something to say so people were ready. They didn't do that. They simply turned to the audience and said, "Does anybody have any Christmas stories?" Well, this one guy, he was an elderly gentleman by that time. He told about being in Germany during the First World War. As I've already mentioned in other contexts, the Germans love Christmas. Christmas is such a wonderful time for them. And they like Christmas trees. That's where our tradition comes from. Any event, he's a kid and his dad is in the service. His dad's off to war. And his mother said, "Well, let's put up a Christmas tree. So when your father comes home, he'll get to see the Christmas tree." Well, Christmas came and went and the father didn't come. Mom said, "I won't take the Christmas tree down. Because whenever he does come, it'll be like Christmas, it'll be a celebration." After a while, all the needles dry up and fall off. It comes around to the next year, Christmas, and Dad still hasn't come home. So they take the old Christmas tree, which is probably just a bunch of needles by now on the floor, and they move the ornaments over to a new Christmas tree. There was no Christmas because Dad never came home. Okay, I've already mentioned this. Germany gets food from neutrals, some food. Enough to help out, sure, no doubt about that at all. Enough to change the situation, probably not. Britain tries to strangle the neutrals, but they really don't have the resources to make sure that nothing can come into Norway and Sweden. When the United States comes in, starting in 1917, we're not one of the major naval powers yet. By the end of 1918, because of a very large building program in the United States didn't quite have the largest navy in the world. Had the war gone on literally a few more months into 1919, the United States would have had the largest navy. So I'm saying that the United States is not insignificant in any sense at all, as far as Navy is concerned. With the help of the American Navy, the United States Navy, Britain is able to strangle the neutrals. We call them embargoes. Europe starves. Well, not everybody, but Europe has a big problem, particularly any of the neutrals that can trade with Germany, and also Germany and her allies, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, Turkey. They all suffer. In reading about Herbert Hoover, remember I showed you I did an article on him a number of years ago. Reading about Herbert Hoover, I got reading his autobiography and other things that she wrote, get an insight into his mentality and what he thought about this. Remember, this is the moralist. This is the guy who wants to feed people. He wants to feed people even if some people like Winston Churchill say you're actually aiding the Germans. He says, I don't care. I want to feed people. What did Herbert Hoover think of the blockade? He says it's a bad way to make war. Why is this? The resources, whatever resources you have in the country, will go to your top priority. It will go to your war machine. Whatever food's available is going to go to the military. It's also going to go to the people in essential industries that help support the military. It's everybody else that's outside of that loop are going to have to do without. So the people actually doing the productivity for the war, the people actually doing the killing, that's going to be maintained. They're going to keep that going. It's the innocents that suffer. The people that are not involved in this. The women that are not in essential industries, and children, and the aged. Here's a little speculation. Herbert Hoover wonders. Now, he wrote this book in the 1950s. So he had the perspective of both the First World War and the Second World War. But his autobiography, talking about helping various people, he wonders if the blockade made for brutal Germans in World War II. You see, many men that are involved in, shall we say, mid-management, men in their 40s during the Second World War, the guys running the concentration camps, the men that are involved in medical experiments, that are involved in exceptional cruelty. He wonders if the blockade made for more brutal Germans in World War II. The argument is essentially this. As you're developing as a child, if you're developing as a child, there are certain critical times in your life when you need certain nutrients. Remember when I was talking about Belgian relief? I made a big deal over this. I said that Herbert Hoover made sure there were fat in crackers that you could give to young kids so there'd be proper development of their neural systems, in other words, proper development of their brains. If this was a problem in Germany and these young boys did not get proper nutrients, does that mean that they developed abnormally? Now the argument is this: if you don't, what happens to you if you don't have those proper fats and nutrients at the proper time in your life? Some of your mental development, can we say, is retarded. And studies have borne this out. If you don't have enough food, these kids can become more brutal. They can lash out. They become discipline problems. And if you stick them in a Nazi uniform, they can actually end up killing people or doing pretty awful things. It's just a think piece. Is it worth considering? I'm not sure. You see, to prove this, you'd have to pick out historically your test case, your number of these guys here. And the guys who are in the concentration camps, the guys who did pretty awful things. And then you'd have to be able to trace back somehow to their experiences during the First World War when most of these men were children. You simply go back and say, well, can we document their level of nutrition, or in this case, lack thereof? You see, that becomes very hard. I'm not going to say that this is a viable theory that you can hang your hat on, but I've wondered about that. I've wondered a lot about that. Could this have led to some other problems? How do we explain evil in human communities? I'm not prepared to say. Interesting thought piece. Well, how many people actually die? You know, if you're actually to the point where you're running 1,000 calories a day, you're going to do some severe damage potentially over time to your internal organs. So how many people die? Can we actually document this? It becomes challenging. Let's say you had a graph, and I've seen graphs in books. You have a graph, and this is the death rate in Germany before 1914. And it simply goes up like this. And there's always people dying. So this is your death rate. Starting in the war, the death rate kind of goes like this. And then it goes like this. So the death rate in Germany, I'm not talking the men at the front. I'm talking the civilian populations back home. The men at the front, you throw them in, of course, the numbers are quite large. But you take in the numbers of people dying. And the number of people that die goes up considerably during the length of the war, obviously during the length of the blockade. Since the blockade lasted after 1918, are we including the people who died after the war was over when the blockade was continued? Taking that increased number, we can say, at least the argument has been made, 750,000 German civilians died because of the blockade. If that is the reason why these people die, then we can say the blockade causes 750,000 civilians to die. My question is, and I desperately, wrong word, I clearly believe that this is a factor. But I also want to state that, have you isolated all your variables? And maybe you have. You see, when the war breaks out, you have an awful lot of men out of the front, and the casualties are huge. So the medical profession, doctors and nurses, you get as many of these guys and ladies as you can and get them out of the front. Now, there's going to be training. You're going to get doctors coming forward. You're going to get additional nurses. The question I'm asking is that when you actually withdraw the medical profession out of Germany, are people in Germany suffering from a lack of medicine? As I've already mentioned, when you're pushing people back in, maybe that's not terribly valid because you do have enough doctors, enough nurses later on. On the other hand, we do have to discuss hospital facilities and medications. Germany's under an embargo. Do you have, I guess you can put this in the ledger, if Germany is being blockaded and you can't bring in medicines to help people survive, well, that does contribute to these death rates. The issue of how many men actually died in Germany during the First World War is subject to some consternation. But we usually say that about 1.8 million men, Germans, were killed in the First World War. If that's reliable, and it's probably ballpark anyway, if that's reliable, then of the German civilians who die in the war, almost half as many civilians die because of the blockade as men die in battle. Going back to people like Herbert Hoover, who make very big statements in this area. I mean, he goes as far as say, not only is this a bad way to make war, but it's immoral. Because who are you killing? The question of morality. When the Western powers at the end of the First World War come in, and Hoover and his boys, a lot of men, and they're going through and documenting what is actually happening here. And you see starving children. By the end of 1918, there's over 20,000 children in Berlin alone that are suffering from rickets, which is a severe vitamin deficiency. I am very impressed by some of these films they took at that time. They're going and they're looking at children with rickets, and these little skeletons are sitting in the hospitals. I remember they took a small child, little boy. They're trying to show him, so they're kind of moving him around, move his head and that kind of stuff. They pull his arms up. And they take their hands away and his arms lay like this. Is that why we did it? All that blood, all that time, all that expenditure, is that why we did it? Was to do those kind of things to children? It's hard to dismiss that. Well, let's go on. Let's go look at what's happening to the men in the trenches. Let's look at the soldier's experience. Soldier experience / trench warfare. Maybe I should have done this. Maybe I should title this next section of our discussion a little bit differently. Maybe I should have called it The Hell Where Youth Will Have to Go. One of the prominent writers in Britain during the First World War was Siegfried Sassoon. This guy likes to write autobiographical materials. One, I believe, is called Confessions of a Fox Hunting Man. Another one, I believe the next volume, is Confessions of an Infantry Officer. This is one of the better received autobiographies of men who were actually in the war. He writes about his experience. It's a very good book. I urge you to read it. But he's writing poetry during the war. He's writing poetry after the war. Can we say he essentially said his piece at the end of the war? He wrote his autobiography, wrote some poetry. But the experience bothers him so much. For the remainder of his life, see, he lives for a long time after the war is over. What, 50 years? He lives for a long time after the war. He cannot get it out of his brain. He wants to move on to other things. It keeps coming back to haunt him. Anyway, let's go back and look at what he's saying about the experience. This is a poem which he publishes, as you can see, in 19, called Suicide in the Trenches. See if we can get it up here. Suicide in the Trenches. Oh, okay, it's kind of small over here. Can I enlarge that a little bit? Not going to work. Bear with me, I got to lean forward. Suicide in the Trenches. I knew a simple soldier boy who grinned at life with empty joy, slept soundly through the lonesome dark, and whistled early with the lark. In winter trenches, cold and glum, with crumps and lice and lack of rum, he put a bullet through his brain. No one spoke of him again. You smug-faced crowds with kindling eye, who cheer when soldier lads march by, sneak home and pray you'll never know the hell where youth will have to go. Maybe I should have entitled this section, The Hell Where Youth Will Have to Go. Let's talk about the trenches. Let's talk about the human experience Let's talk about what it was like. I mentioned in another context, the motion picture, which I urge you very strongly to see. It's called Oh, What a Lovely War. It's a motion picture. It doesn't really have character development. You have a few people that show up over and over again. Most of it, the vast majority, is actually just acting out some of the songs that the men sang when they were in the trenches. Now, one of the things they said, let me see if I can find that one as well. It's called I Don't Want to Be a Soldier. Oh, well. Lyrics. I don't want to be a soldier, mama. I don't want to die. Well, I don't want to be a soldier, mama. I don't want to fly. Well, I don't want to be a failure, mama. I don't want to cry. Well, I don't want to be a soldier, mama. I don't want to die. Oh, no. Oh, no. Oh, no. It goes on. Not going to read the entire thing. Well, I think I've actually have a pretty good poem, but this is not exactly the one I was looking for, because this, I don't want to be a soldier, mama, and the one I'm looking for is I don't want to be a soldier. It's an old British song. I have the wrong one again. Okay, well, I'm not going to spend more time looking for it. But in one of the refrains, it says, send out me brother, sometimes send for me brother, send out me brother, me sister and me mother. But for God's sake, don't send me. Oh my, I don't want to die. I want to go home. Can I show you that one? That's how I want to go home. Okay. I know the sound quality is pretty bad. Let's try it.
Important Medicare
Please
message.
excuse
Scammers
me.
are
Oh my
using
God.
coronavirus to steal Medicare numbers, but you can protect yourself.
Yeah.
If you get a call offering COVID-19 items and they ask for your Medicare number, hang up. Learn more at
can't even skip it.
medicare.gov/fraud.
I want to go home. I want to go home. I don't want to go in the trenches no more, where whiz-bangs and shrapnel they whistle and roar. Take me over the sea, where the
Alleyman means Germany.
Oh my, I don't want to die. I want to go home. Take me over the seas, where the alleyman can't get at me. Oh my, I don't want to die. I want to go home.
let's get out of that. And let me check my time here. I've got a little time, so I want to continue this discussion. I want to at least bring in Remarque at this point to have a little bit of discussion on him. It's been my experience that very often when students actually have an interest in the First World War, kind of what sets them off is when a high school teacher gave them an assignment to read All Quiet on the Western Front, which is Remarque's brilliant war novel. To a certain extent, it's a masterpiece. I've read it a couple of times. The first time I read it, I was in junior high school. Then I read it when I was like 19. So it's been something that I've been very impressed with. Now, you have to be very careful. Sometimes when people read this, and it reads like a first-person narrative. Remember, Paul Baumer, is the person that is really talking about it, matter-of-factly, talking about his experiences. But it's a novel. It is a novel that has many distortions, many inaccuracies, many things that really didn't happen. Quite frankly, some of these are stupid. I'm not telling you not to read this book. If you want to understand the First World War, there's going to be perspectives that's really going to come in a lot of different directions. And people will refer to this. But remember, you're reading a novel. You're reading a fabrication. However, can I say a fabrication does have some merit? I like a quote by Pablo Picasso. Picasso, as you well know, is a world famous artist, very, very well received. The guy was stunningly prolific, and he's very well received in the artistic community. And he's talking about art. I actually would like to throw literature in that as well. So I think this is appropriate. Anyway, here's a quote from Picasso. Art is a lie. All Quiet on the Western Front is a lie. Art is a lie that makes us realize the truth. In all fairness to Remarque, can we actually say that his distortions are within the framework enough to help us understand the bigger picture? So why do I say that he takes a lot of poetic license? As I recall early in the book, that the men are out in an area where there's a French graveyard, and the graveyard is being shelled. Now remember, usually when the French bury their dead, it's like 2 meters underground. It's like 6 feet. And according to Remarque, the shells are coming over, blowing open the graves. There are times when the shells go in, this is what would have to happen. You're 6 feet under the ground. The shell would have to go in under the ground. You would have to explode and blow that thing up in the air. And it's flying around. Remember, corpses come out. And it comes down and lands on a guy's arm, and you have to pull the corpse out of the casket before you get it off this guy's arm. I'm sorry, that's simply not possible. If you have a shell coming in, it's going to obliterate that casket. It's not going to blow it way up in the air and have the thing be completely intact. I don't care what you make that coffin out of. That's not going to happen. Is this an exaggeration? Absolutely. It's fabrication? Absolutely. But can we say it does give us a sense of understanding how awful the bombardment could be? You know, there's a number of things like that I do caution you to be careful about when you're reading this or rereading it. The one that actually bothered me the most is his depictions. Remember, Paul gets wounded. Paul goes back into a lazaret. What's that in English? It's a hospital. And it's like they're torturing them there. You see, you find men with flat feet. Now, these guys have already been in the military, if they have flat feet or not. They've still been functioning well in the military. So you're going to take these guys, the doctors are going to take these men, come in and experiment on them and break their bones. Break their bones. So they'll have an arch rather than flat feet. Ah, come on. if there is anything that's really praiseworthy in all this mess, or should I say perhaps the most praiseworthy, is how they treat you in the hospitals. Rather than being hellholes of torture, these are some of the kindest and most benevolent things you'll ever read about. I remember reading one account by a guy in the hospital. They bring in men with horrific casualties. I mean, just terrible casualties. I mean, some guys have their faces blown off, their jaws literally gone, a hole where their faces used to be. And maybe you have an opportunity to save them, maybe not. Sometimes the doctors would come around and look at these guys and turn to his orderly and say, "I'll give this man a shot of morphine, 4 times the usual amount." In other words, that much morphine would kill the man. If that were me and I was horrifically wounded that much, that badly, I would hope that these people in their kindness would do that for me. Then the nurses, these women work all these hours. They see horrific things. They smell horrific things. Vera Brittain, an English woman, wrote an extremely interesting autobiography about her nursing experiences in the First World War. And yeah, sometimes they bring in the Germans to be treated in a British hospital. Of course, they call them filthy Huns and these terrible things. But they treat them with as much care and dignity as they do the British people, the British soldiers. Sometimes when the guys get a little bit better, the women flirt with them a little bit, a little touch of home. Sometimes these women hold men's hands when they die. Sometimes the men don't even know that they're there. But you're there to be compassionate. There were women who said at the end of the wars, nobody then died in our unit, but nobody died alone. Why would Remarque say this? One of the reasons why Remarque survived the war, he did have some experiences at the front, but one of the reasons why he survived the war is he's working in the hospital. I mean, he knew that what he was saying was a lie. No. Can't you praise that which is praiseworthy? Do not insult. Put it this way, do not insult the people trying to patch these guys up. Many years ago, they made a motion picture. It's one of the first great talking motion pictures that I think had ever been made. It's called All Quiet on the Western Front. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1930, which probably meant it was shot in 1929. Another film I urge you very strongly to see. I think of all the films that depict the soldiers' experience in the First World War, this is probably the best one, because actually in trying to tell you what happened, even though it's based on a novel where there are distortions involved. They did a remake, I believe in the 1970s. And I'm in graduate school and I don't have access to a TV. So I don't think they have this on campuses anymore. They used to have student union centers where if you want to go watch television or just hang out and lounge around on a sofa, you can do that. And sometimes it's a good place to study. I don't see that so much. The buildings like at Utah State they used to use for that, I think have been used for other things nowadays. Any event back then, you could go watch television, and I wanted to watch a television show. I wanted to see this remake of All Quiet on the Western Front to get my take on it. It's a very good film. I also urge you to see that. I don't think it's as good as the 1930 version, nonetheless. I went over to the Student Union building. TV was on. I started watching the thing, trying to get my assessment of what I thought of it. And the guy came in, he's smiling and laughing. Ha, ha, ha. He says, "Where are we in the film?" I says, "Well, this is the place where they beat up Himmelstoss. Himmelstoss. Remember, he was the pretty mean guy who was pushing around the troops. And this kid's laughing. My God, why don't you dig up Remarque and spit in his face?" My favorite quote from Remarque is an introduction to his novel. This book is to be neither an accusation nor a confession, and least of all an adventure, for death is not an adventure to those who stand face to face with it. It will try simply to tell of a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped the shells, were destroyed by the war. This is not funny. Try to understand what somebody's saying and don't look at it as an adventure. Read Remarque, but read it as a novel. I'm over time. Appreciate all of you. And we will talk more next time. Remember, this is lecture number 15. See you later.